Welcome to the Unveiling Shadows podcast. I'm your host, Kimberly Mosby. Join me as I dive into powerful stories of resilience and strength. In each episode, I sit down with guests who have faced similar journeys of coercive control, financial manipulation, and personal invasion. Together, we uncover the shadows, share our experiences, and inspire others to reclaim their lives. Tune in, listen, and be a part of the community that stands tall against the forces that seek to control us. Hello, and welcome to Unveiling Shadows podcast. I am going to do a solo cast today from a post on X or from X. MKUltra guinea pig posted with Dr. Nick Begich, I think is how you pronounce it, Begich, Begich. And when I tried to Google this guy to find out what his profile was, it didn't give me much information. So I went to Grok on X, their AI search tool. And it says Dr. Nick Begich Jr. is known for his work in several areas, including technology, mind effects, and environmental issues. Here's a brief overview based on available information. He's done some media appearances, has appeared in various documentaries and media, notably in the Alaska Triangle, Why in the World Are They Spraying, and Beyond the Unknown. He is often discussed in contents related to conspiracy theories, especially around topics like HAARP, High Frequency Active Aerial Research Program, mind control, and weather modification. So he's co-authored several books. Begich, I hope I'm not, murdering his name, but whatever. Begich has been featured as an expert witness before the European Parliament on subjects related to HAARP and mind effects. He's also been a frequent commentator on radio and television talk shows discussing new technologies, energy, politics, education, and the environment, which we know they all go together. There's nothing separate here. Let's go to this video from MKUltra Guinea Pig, because that's what it feels like when you're in this program. And I will start the video.
It became a pretty compelling issue that I thought the public should be aware of. I have a background in traditional and
frequency energy. This was kind of an emerging area of interest to U.S. researchers. In fact, you can go back to the 1980s, where there was a lot of interest in sort of looking at what could you do with radio frequency energy in terms of the human body. And it was the Air Force that actually contracted a study. This study was done at the University of Utah, and it resulted in the Radio Frequency Dosimetry Handbook, which is a handbook to describe.
It's interesting how a few of these projects return back to Utah. Alex Jones and Dr. John Hall, where they did some experimentation on prisoners here at the local prison using direct energy warfare.
Specific radio frequency dosages necessary to override the function of the various vital organs of the human body: heart, liver, lungs, brain, etc. And primarily, this basic research was being developed for weapons applications and design of future weapons. In fact, anyone who's followed sort of the development of weapon systems, we are tending to move further and further away from bombs and bullets and ordnance and more into things that affect us on a much more profound level, using electromagnetic fields as a primary weapon of the future, whether they be high-powered microwaves or whether they be lasers. But the technology is changing. In fact, what the military now calls it is a revolution of military affairs on RMA, similar to what happened in the Middle Ages when gunpowder was introduced into Europe, or the changes that occurred after atomic weapons were developed in the last century. The same kind of revolution is taking place today, has been since the 1980s, perhaps even much before that.
How advanced is the technology become, or do we even know the full scale?
You can look at sort of what have they done so far. They've changed the antenna design dramatically. In fact, some of the earlier concepts required many kilometers, square kilometers size antennas. But the new technology and the way in which we can manipulate energy has reduced that scale. We've learned a lot about the ionosphere in the interim. And when you think about an instrument like HAARP, think about it like a tuner or a primer on a bullet that contains sort of the small amount of energy that then plugs into an actual part of the environment, changes the energy state of that part of the environment, and then uses natural energy as sort of the drawing source. So for instance, very low frequency energy can be pumped up into the ionosphere. When it arrives there, it captures some of the localized energy and energy that you can manipulate, and then you use the Earth itself as the key to your weapon system. That is a big change in the way we've approached the Earth as it couples up with military science.
You know, what could we actually do with this kind of system? And one was stabilizing the ionosphere, this layer again that begins about 30 miles above the Earth's surface, extending several hundred miles out from there. The second was, could we destabilize sufficiently to knock out everybody's communication? And could we, in the course of destabilizing it, use that same signal for carrying our own communications? In other words, deny everyone else the ability to communicate, but maintain our own military's ability to do so. And in fact, those aspects of the technology were probably one of the more interesting ones from a military perspective. The other was the effect of being able to generate an over-the-horizon radar effect, being able to look around the curvature of the Earth for incoming objects. In fact, interestingly enough, the location of HAARP is the location that was originally designated for the over-the-horizon radar system just before the fall of the former Soviet Union as our sort of early warning system. Because the old systems essentially would find things way high up. You know, intercontinental ballistic missiles could be spotted pretty easily, but things at a low elevation, cruise missiles, for instance, could not be detected. Things that were launched relatively close to the US from, say, submarines would not be easily detected. With this system, you could detect everything from intercontinental ballistic missiles all the way down to cruise missiles and everything in between, even at close range. So that became a very interesting application of technology. And the way that would essentially work is they would create, using two transmitters, one would create a cold plasma mirror, a layer of energy that they could move, much in the same way you could move a hand mirror to bounce light. But in this case, a second signal concentrating radio frequency energy would strike this plasma, and then they could redirect it around the curvature of the Earth and be used for detecting these incoming objects. If you could increase the power of HAARP sufficiently, or transmitters like this sufficiently, you could create an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse, a surge of energy sufficient to knock out or disrupt the avionics on those incoming craft and cause them to malfunction and crash. Now, EMPs, the way that a lot of that kind of became of interest in terms of military applications was there was a test done in the 1960s in the Pacific where we test an atmospheric weapon. It created an electromagnetic pulse that knocked out power in Hawaii for several hours. And then the concern was, wow, what if somebody ever detonated high enough above the United States? And this is particularly a concern today, where so much of our microelectronics would be highly disrupted by that kind of activity. So from the standpoint of sort of a radiation-free method of doing it, HAARP became that sort of radiation-free method of creating an EMP. The other thing is, and this gets into mainly the workshop that we'll be getting in tonight, gets into this a little bit more as well, the idea of affecting weather systems, because as you push that atmosphere out, you change the localized pressure systems within the region. You also have the ability to move jet streams around. That can have a profound effect on weather systems much further distant from the actual location. In fact, coincidentally, there was a publication that actually showed the jet stream moving through Alaska approximately over the area of HAARP, and then it made this very small change. It went up about 50 miles, it went then east about 70 miles, and then dropped 50 miles south, and then went on its way. And at that time, it moved weather systems. That jet stream moved weather systems out of central Texas into Florida, where it dropped tornadoes into Orlando at the time, which created a lot of problems, pretty rare for Florida. coincidentally right above HARP. In fact, it is one of the things that you would expect from HARP if a jet stream were in the area and you were using this particular application.
Okay, I have to say something because last night or the night before, I was watching MSNBC and they had Bill Nye on there. You know, Bill Nye's the science guy, talking about climate change and weather. And I looked up his information, and he is an educator and he did a children's show. And the fact that they were inviting him on this news station, in my opinion, to discuss something of this magnitude is quite ridiculous. Like, I would rather listen to this guy who seems to know what is going on and not Bill Nye, the science guy with his stupid bow tie.
The other area that came out, and this came from Ben Eastland, it was one of the last things he did prior to his death in 2007. He did a paper for the University of Pennsylvania on weather modification particularly, and where he had determined that you could actually utilize HARP at its current power levels for manipulating gravitational waves, which would have an effect on weather systems from his perspective. In fact, he said that you could manipulate weather systems with 1,600 times less energy than he originally had predicted when he designed HARP. In other words, the current system can do these things. If you think about tornado formation, you have a warm front coming up against a cold front, creates a shearing action, which gives you this tornado formation. The idea was if you could heat up the cold front sufficiently to when they hit each other to not create that differential, that you wouldn't see those tornadoes form. It's an interesting idea, but if you were sort of off on your calculation, you end up heating up the warm front a little bit more than it is. You actually create a greater differential in a more extreme situation where maybe more powerful tornadoes form. The fact is, even the idea of experimenting in this area of weather modification, many people think, well, you know, how new is that or how old is that? It goes back a long way. In fact, it was in 1977 that the United States signed an international agreement to not use geophysical manipulation as a weapon of war. We were one of 60 countries to agree to that, and that treaty actually was one initiated by the former Soviet Union. In all of that, you go back to those days, and what did the treaty really say? It said that we couldn't cross our borders in these types of experiments, which is kind of strange when you think about it, because weather doesn't really recognize borders at all. These artificial lines drawn on the globe. One of the other areas that came up in the course of the advancement of HARP was the idea of ELF generation, extremely low frequency generation. The way that's done is by modulating the high frequency signal coming off of HARP. So you can kind of envision this as sort of a hammer punching into the ionosphere. And every time that energy punched or was modulated, the ionosphere will modulate a signal in harmony with that. So imagine pumping energy into the ionosphere in one location, and that the ionosphere perhaps for 1,000 miles begin to modulate a signal back to the Earth and act as a transmitter. Changes the character of the ionosphere from direct current to an alternating current, where it then acts as a broadcast antenna in the sky, producing a huge amount of energy and even capitalizing on the energy that's there, and then sending that back to the Earth. And this was going to be used for what was called Earth penetrating tomography. In fact, this technology was proven up. I mean, there was a BBC special, I think it was called Owning the Ionosphere. It was on a show called Horizons, where one of the researchers talked about this, where they were able to underground image. That signal coming back to the Earth would allow them Earth penetrating tomography, underground imaging, which by analogy or comparison would be like X-raying the Earth or looking into the Earth, although X-rays are not involved. But what would happen is they could penetrate the Earth, return a signal back, and then determine exactly what was under there, whether it be oil and gas fields, certain types of mineral stratas, or underground nuclear facilities and bases and so on, which this was right after the first Gulf War, and it was our Senate that demanded that this particular application be the one that that was looked at, or no additional funding would come forward for HARP. So in 1995-96, it was funded under non-proliferation and counter-proliferation in the U.S. defense budget, where they proved that this concept would actually work.
Okay, I want to mention that on the map that they were showing where HARP is, it's actually in Antarctica, where they're not allowing people to go. And there's a reason for that, in my opinion.
One of the problems with ELF is they also are biologically active in human beings. And this was the area that drew my interest in HARP initially. The idea that an ELF signal, an extremely low frequency signal that can couple with the human being that create changes in us was extremely important. In fact, tomorrow I'll get into a lot of that in a broader context of how to affect the human brain using ELF signals and other signal generation. But HARP is the largest generator of that type in the world. The idea of, and to give a little context to this, when you think about the human brain, active brain states, you can kind of break it into a few primary areas. In the extremely deep sleep states, you have a delta range, which is 1 to 4 hertz approximately, or think about a hertz as a pulse per second or vibration per second, just to keep it simple. So 1 to 4 vibrations per second is delta. The next stage, theta, which is approximately 4 to about 7 hertz, and then 7 to 12 hertz is the alpha range, and then into the beta range, which is, I think, where everyone is right now, because I don't see anyone falling asleep. The point is, these ranges can be affected through what's called brain entrainment, which is an external signal, or what's called frequency following response, where the brain will recognize certain signals in a very similar way to dialing through a radio. You know, you pick up the radio station, you get nice clear signal with a receiver and the transmitter. The same is true with the human body. Most of the models that look at the human body use chemical models, although that has changed a great deal in the last 20 years. It went from chemical models to electrochemical models to perhaps electromagnetic models that drive the computer.
And without consent. So if you can't detect it, that means you can be a non-consensual test subject, like a lab rat in their experiment.
This is a
propaganda at its finest, or mind control, in my opinion, or mind manipulation. We could start calling it mind manipulation if you want, but I still won't comply. Not today or any other motherfucking day.
kind of technology that we're talking about here in this century.
Is there any evidence that they've used these types of technologies or same things that they've used against the Iraqi military domestically in these protest groups?
Well, there actually was in Great Britain in an issue dealing with public protest back in the 90s. There was a technology used. It was an infrasound device that actually.
Okay, look at this. Look at this device. So I'm in Utah, and my ex-parents are very wealthy and extremely highly political. They're very politically connected. But I want to show you these pictures that I took, that I sent myself. So I called them Gwen. Okay, so look at this device and this long-range acoustic device. See how similarly they are, or how similar they are? They're very similar in nature. These are at the top of every basically stoplight in Salt Lake City, Utah. And then if you take that and mix it with these, which I call Gwen towers. So people think these are regular cell phone towers, but there never used to be this many, and there's been the same population here for a really long time. But these are, in my opinion, part of a slow kill device, which is using radiation to cause people to have cancer. Then I'm going to go to this last picture because they will lease space from people and have them put them on their buildings to get closer to whatever targeted individual they need to be close to, in my opinion. So this is across from my business building that's facing directly at the building that I am in. So it's very interesting to me. And when you really think about it, it's extremely evil. That's evil, rotten to its core. So now let's get back to showing you the rest of this video. All right.
Scattered the crowd.
Their new active denial system boasts a reach far beyond any other non-lethal system, about 7 football fields to give it some perspective. It can deter individuals on a military perimeter all the way up to a riotous crowd, all without permanent harm.
It only penetrates 1/64 of an inch of your skin. So it's very shallow into where your nerve receptors are, and there's no permanent injury caused by it. Very safe system. We've built in some safety margins.
Most described it as feeling like a hot oven or grill being opened up.
Okay, a very safe system, but it feels like a very hot room or a grill being opened up. And they say that it's harmful. In my opinion, I don't believe that.
Active denial technology uses radio frequency millimeter waves at a frequency of 95 gigahertz. Traveling at the speed of light, the millimeter wave directed energy engages the subject, penetrating the skin to a depth of only about 1/64 of an inch. The beam produces an intolerable heating sensation, compelling the targeted individual to instinctively move.
There was another one developed that's been sold actually to the military for perimeter protection, and that was actually won the Lemelson MIT Prize in 2005. Woody Norris, who developed a method of acoustic heterodyning, where he could literally send a signal into a certain zone within an area or space where anyone walking in that zone would hear that proverbial voice in the head. But the person right,
AKA subliminal messaging. They're doing it in stores now. Probably some of the ones that you frequent with large corporations, which in my opinion are part of this research and development plan being launched against citizens, basically all of humanity. Some of us just know it, and some of us can hear it, and some of us just think we're getting old and ill and have tinnitus, the ringing in the ears, which is part of the radio frequency. And so you can't not have tinnitus one day and then all of a sudden have it. There's a distinct sound to the radio frequency, also known as Havana syndrome, where military people have been affected by that, but also normal civilians. So I just want people to be aware that this technology is out there.
next to them, outside of that zone, outside of that target zone, wouldn't hear a thing.
Hypersonic sound works by emitting 2 highly directional ultrasonic signals at frequencies too high for humans to hear. As these signals mix in the air, however, a column of audible sound is created. Norris envisions using his invention for everything from surround sound units to museum displays.
All of those kinds of illusionary things associated with schizophrenia, you could actually impose on someone, and they would know the difference between the artificially imposed sound signal and that proverbial voice in the head.
Okay. And then just to point this out again, many of us are older that are being targeted. Some of us, aren't. But I'm just saying that schizophrenia generally will come about in your 20s. It doesn't happen later in life. So there's one thing that needs to be looked at for sure.
In your book, you talk about cyclotronic resonance. What is cyclotronic resonance?
Psychotronic resonance, again, but
Yeah, so Delgado is the one that made the wired bull initially and then said, we don't even need wires. We can control the bull without being neuro-wired or neuro-linked, however you want to call it, however you want to say.
now that was mid-'80s. Where we've gone from there are great leaps. And when you look at where the research initiatives are being funded by DARPA and others, it's surrounding better ways to get higher and higher resolution.
IBM is interesting. So I was born at St. Pete's Hospital in Helena, Montana. And my biological father, we used to visit him every summer. They had these large data processing machines in the room that he was in because he was the manager of data processing. And thinking back and talking to my friend about this when I became a target, I'm thinking back and I'm like, at the time, Helena, Montana probably wasn't more than around 35,000 people. And for them to have like these large data processing computers in a hospital in Montana for, I don't know, a handful of patients doesn't seem accurate to me. Like, it's very interesting because I call Montana no man's land because there's hardly a lot of people there and it's really wide open space. But anyway, it was a thinking back at my life going, now I am drawing the pieces of the puzzle together.
What governments should do?
No, it's not.
In terms of the legal framework for using technology that would influence human behavior, there really isn't any. I mean, if you think about it, in fact, when we went to the European Parliament on these issues back in the late 90s, that was one of the outgrowths of it. In fact, in their resolution dealing with security and disarmament, which passed, I believe it was January of 1999, is the most comprehensive document ever on security and disarmament produced by the European Parliament. One of the sections, there were actually 4 sections that dealt with HARP, and then there was a 5th section that we were able to get into the record, which dealt with mind effects, mind control technologies, and that treaty dialogue should begin in this area, that this is an area where there is no treaty. There is a huge gap in terms of where this technology has gone and the fact that the legal frameworks are not there to protect people on a domestic level or internationally.
They're not. The legal and justice system isn't there to protect people, unfortunately, in my opinion, because I've taken my case to the FBI 3 times, twice over the phone, once in person, took it to Doppel, where I had the doctor inject me with his nanotechnology, and which is a bioweapon. I'll get into that more later when I preview the Alex Jones and Dr. John Hall video. And then I took it up to the Department of Justice just to receive an email back that says we may or may not be looking into your case. So tell me where the justice is in this system. It's extremely broken. And we, as the guinea pigs, know that this is going on. But yet you can't go to your local law enforcement. The community outreach programs are part of it. Isolation is part of it. So then where will this come to an end where we can actually have our own brain that's free again for the free will that was granted to us by the universe? Those are my thoughts.
The Russian Duma passed resolutions in 2002 asking for the same things. The fact is the temptation to use the technology. In fact, you can go back to the politics of the technology, go back to Zbigniew Brzezinski in his book, Between Two Ages. And he talked about, quoting from a guy, J.F. Gordon MacDonald, a geophysicist at UCLA, and he said in that book that we would eventually get to the point where we could electronically stroke the ionosphere in just the right way to return a signal to the Earth that would change the behavior of people over huge geographic areas. This is what HARP can do today. That system can't deliver on that, but so can any other electromagnetic carrier. So you can target individuals or you can target masses of people and affect a huge segment of that population. Things like near field exposures to other signals might dampen it with some people, but on a large scale, the data shows 70, maybe as much as 80% of the population could be influenced by these external causes. The thing is, without legal framework, would the government do it? Absolutely, yes. In fact, in 2006, the Air Force, the United States Air Force, revised their protocols for human experimentation. And on page 9 of that, they actually call out who's authorized on mind control experiments. And they use those words in their document
Without
in 2006.
consent. Experimentation means any research or testing activity involving human subjects that may expose such subjects to the possibility of permanent or temporary injury, including physical or psychological damage and damage to the reputation of such persons beyond the risk of injury to which such subjects are ordinarily exposed in their daily lives without consent.
And what they say is it has to be approved by an undersecretary of the Navy or assistant secretary of the Navy. Someone at that level is the only one, and including issues that would bring about controversies in terms of the media.
Listen to this one. For purposes of this instruction, the term, quote, human subjects includes any person, whether or not such person is a U.S. person. No prisoner of war civilians, internees, retained, and detained personnel are covered under the Geneva Conventions of 1949 may be the subjects of human experimentation. Wow, that means everybody.
Be approved at that level. But this is in the current framework of Navy protocols. Experimentation goes on. The Air Force has requests for proposals out. DARPA has contracts that have been let. They all come together under one umbrella with the idea of affecting the human operator. What we learn about the human body and brain when it has weapons applications and the research is funded by the military, don't think it's being done for medical science. The military in our country doesn't fund medical research. That's somebody else, unless it has a specific weapons application or specific use within the Veterans Administration. And Veterans Administration is often used to test new ideas, to test new concepts. So our servicemen get the experiment of war and then get the experiment after the fact. Even in the MKUltra releases of information in the 19s, from the 60s and the early 70s, over 4,000 men and women that they admit in the U.S. military were used as experimental subjects without fully informed consent. Secretary of Energy O'Leary under the Clinton administration said over 500,000 Americans have been used in human experiments over 4 decades.
Over 500,000 of Americans have been used as test subjects without their consent.
Mind control and other experiments without their informed consent. 500,000 people they admit to, and no one's been put on trial for that. No one's been held accountable for that. I think most Americans find that highly objectionable.
I do.
That no one's been held accountable for invading the very essence of who they are as human beings. That's the problem. It's been going on 40 years. It continues to today under the guise of increased security. Increased security for what? If you don't have freedom of thought foundationally, what the heck are we securing and for whom? When you talk about the Manchurian candidate kind of concept, you go back to the work of Estabrooks, who started at Harvard's hypnotherapy labs. And what he believed, and his work subsequently in the 30s was classified, but he released information in the 1960s in his published work where he had achieved this, that he had actually created, was able to take somebody into such a deep state of hypnosis and over a 10-month period, literally program in a separate personality, one distinctly separate from the other. So what he could do is you would function like a normal person, but then you could take on this other persona. They could send you in, and the idea was to create the super spy, send you into a country where if they caught you, you'd have no recollection of your former self, but you'd be collecting data. Then you come back, and then something that the MKUltra hearings in the Church Committee in the 1970s brought out was in fact one of the things that the CIA was doing. They were using hallucinogenics. They were using all kinds of electronics, whatever they thought they could to influence behavior in over 140 sub-projects under MKUltra. Most of those records were shredded.
Over 140 sub-projects of MKUltra. I have a list somewhere where I will list them out and read them off to you. I don't know all of them, but I know that we're probably past MKUltra 5.0 and probably more than 300 sub-projects of this program, in my opinion.
Accounting records came to light much, much later that revealed quite a bit of information. In fact, the whole idea of looking at what we used to call PSI or paraphysics or ESP, extrasensory perceptions, were all subject of U.S. Military research, CIA research going back into the 1960s. A lot of the declassified data, over 700 pages of declassified data, we posted on our website, just dealing with that issue from that era. When you look at suppression of information within the United States, as an example, it was, I think in the 90s, up to 40% of the Air Force equipment budget was classified. In other words, it was black. It was so black that nobody knew what it was. 40% of the equipment budget in the Air Force is billions and billions of dollars. When you look at advanced research in terms of how it comes forward, usually what comes out in the public is about 20 years behind where we're at. When you look at all of the history of the United States and the way in which we built our security and military apparatus, including every other nation, that's how they operate. We compartmentalize, we separate deliberately, we break it down into small components, which is very expensive and results in a lot of duplication. But at the end of the day, you get something that is really well hidden. I mean, even the Manhattan Project brought us atomic bomb. Nobody knew it till the end of the day. And that's where we are on this technology. The thing is, it's broken out. There's enough information in the record. In the work that we published over the years, there are hundreds and hundreds of citations, and they're not phone booth conversations. These are hard academic documents, academic studies, military releases of information, FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, and other sources of information that clearly document the level in which this technology has advanced, which is again why groups like the European Parliament, the Russian Duma, and others are now beginning to weigh in opposition to this kind of technology. You know, the whole issue of the secrecy syndrome and how it's developed, you know, it's out of, really, when you think about this kind of research, these kind of topics, I'm often accused of being a conspiratorialist. I want to correct something here. The biggest conspiratorialists in the world are military establishments, because it's their job. They got to think of everything that could ever happen under the sun and then build a plan around that. That's why when something does happen, all of a sudden there's all this action, because there's already been a plan developed. That's how it works. The most paranoid thinkers in the world are military planners, because it's their job. That's what they do. That's what we want them to do. What we don't want them to do is determine public policy. And this is where it has clouded over in the last 20 years. Too much military planners, the military industrial academic complex drives our politics today. And we end up getting in every entanglement around the planet, while the majority of people in this country oppose it. Now we have a technology that can literally let us wage war without raising the flag.
Correct. So you can go to the May 8th, 2024 congressional hearing where the Department of Defense was speaking to the National Security Administration. And he said, yeah, there's a new form of the battleground. And then the guy said, what? One of the National Security Administration. And then the response was, there's no entrance or exit wound. It makes the individual think that they're going crazy.
That's a problem. And the temptation to use these technologies is greater than the political good sense from either party to refrain. And I come from a political background. I had a father in the United States House of Representatives. My younger brother serves in the U.S. Senate today. I got 50 years experience in how politics works. And that's how it works.
It does.
These technologies are being used today wherever it's politically advantageous and wherever it's advantageous from a military perspective. And anyone who thinks otherwise really hasn't read their history and is naive about how the political process works in the United States. Think about it. Extraordinary rendition as a good example. Kidnapping people, taking them to third countries for torture. Is that a representation of American values? I don't think so. It's a representation of a military industrial complex gone wild and being able to put it into public policy. The thing that's happened in media generally is media's become so dispersed that the mainstream, they have a huge impact, because if they want to interview these.
They do have a big impact. And it's BlackRock is the organization's name, and Larry Fink is the owner of BlackRock, which owns about 80 or 88% of the United States.
These same guys, again, there is containment there. You know, when you look at who owns a radio station, 1,500 stations in the United States are owned by one company. When you start to look around what's happened in the deregulation of communications industry, not just in the United States, but in Australia, in Europe, throughout the world, it's created consolidation that has put way too much power in too few. Now, the alternative medias today, a larger segment of the population tunes in, so you're starting to get a broader debate on these issues. But the mainstream is usually last to pick the ball up. And as far as investigative reporting, it's history for most mainstream media. They take a press release and they regurgitate it to the public. They just throw it back at you.
Those are called the talking heads. That's what we refer to them as, the talking heads.
Yeah. But do they really do the analytical, investigative kind of work they used to do? The answer is no, they don't. And to do that, it's done primarily by independents, and eventually the mainstream catches up when it's become an overwhelmingly important issue. When we think about how much comes at us in a day in terms of data, information today, and how it's channeled and how it's controlled, there is so much noise, background noise, telling us how to feel, what to eat, what's going to kill us, what's going to make us well, that just sorting it out has become a huge problem. And again, why the internet's given us everything under the sun in one sense, but at the same time, being able to take that information and put it into some comprehensive, useful form, I think we're all challenged by that, more so now than ever, which is why now, with the opportunity to consolidate data, it's even more important that investigative reporters get engaged. You know, when people say to me, well, you're a scientist, you know, you're this or you're that. No, you know, where I'm at is I have science background that makes it possible for me to look at complex issues, distill it down to provide that information in a coherent way. When you go to get your car repaired, how many of us know how to do that anymore? You know, but yet we can drive it, we can get it from place to place. We need to do that with our technology and our public policy as it relates to it. We don't have to know how to build it. We have to understand enough about it conceptually, and then we have to drive the political process, which is something that's been missing in the mind effects area and the idea of manipulating either our health remotely or our mental states remotely. This requires a general understanding of the fact that it can happen, and then following that, a strong public policy that says when it does, what are the consequences? In most of the world's religions, fooling around with people's free will is something God won't even do. But our military thinks that's their right, their place to play, and they're spending billions of dollars to get there.
That's what I would refer to, in my opinion, as being called the God complex.
I think most of us would agree that's fundamentally wrong. And if anything, we ought to have full disclosure so we understand what's going on and have a right to weigh in as a fundamental right. Think about freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. What good is that if you don't have freedom of thought? The ultimate form of info warfare is manipulating of the human mind. And we are engaged in that. We've released data that was declassified by the CIA on China's initiatives in this area, on the former Soviet Union and currently Russia's initiatives in this area. There are initiatives by Israel, the United States, and then through our allies. Clearly, this is an area of huge importance from a military perspective, because ultimately, if you can control the human operator, perceptions of a population, you can really bring them to their knees. Think about this from the standpoint of even targeting a national leader. What if your national leader in the middle of a radio broadcast to the population, a television news media event, all of a sudden started hearing voices in their head? That'd be the end of it. That's the technology possessed by our government today based on U.S. patents that we've disclosed in the course of our work and based on their own releases of information. But does the general public recognize that? I think more and more people are starting to see it, but it's...
I hope more and more of you wake up, and not only wake up, I need you to start having the courage to speak out and speak up and use your voice so that we can all get through this and hopefully have freedom of thought.
It's taken a long time to put that data in front of the public in a way that's useful and can start to drive policy. The internet's been interesting. You know, when we first began this work, the internet was really in its infancy and no one was paying much attention to it. It was unreliable. And anything you read there, you had to go back and confirm it with the actual article because a lot of things were misquoted, taken out of context. And so we found that kind of clutter that was out there. It's become significantly more refined. I mean, I think that it's provided both the window and opportunity, but at the same time, now also provides a wider net. I mean, think about it. There's nothing that you do on the internet that isn't monitored by at least our security agencies as well as many others. There is no communication on the planet today, whether it is in terms of radio, whether it's in terms of your phone, your cell phone, your internet activity, your Facebook. I don't care what it is. If it's electronically handled, it's tracked, it's monitored, and it's not for your benefit. The change in the law needs to say, we own the information about each one of us, and that there should be a total transformation. This is not corporate property. This is private property.
And without our privacy, we have no freedom.
The digital doorway of today is the physical doorway of yesterday. To guard our privacy in the 21st century, our digital doorway holds more information than will ever be found in anyone's house. And that is what needs to be controlled.
Yep.
I hear from people that purport to be victims of this technology all the time. I mean, I've got hundreds of correspondence from people that have purported to be victims. Now, the problem is sorting it out. You know, are you really a victim of an external technology, or are you a victim of other kinds of psychosis? And you can't sort it out without an external monitoring of that person's life. Well, if they really were the victims of this technology, they just switch it off, because you need spectrum analyzers. You need a lot of things that would look at sort of the whole spectrum of energy coming in around these people to determine whether or not there was any coherent man-made signal that might be affecting their physiology. So you would have to have a huge amount of equipment, number one. And we looked at this, and we actually had talked to a biophysicist and engineers about what would it take. There's no possible way to sort it out without disclosure from the government. And that's really it.
It's the battle for full disclosure.
You can't sort out who's a victim and who isn't. And when you really look at the stories, before the internet was so widely used, those correspondences that we retained were really useful because they were truly independent. Now, because of the internet, people are mirroring each other. So now you can't discern.
He's talking about hive mind syndrome, basically. And this is where I disagree with him, because I am a TI, or a targeted survivor, TS. I prefer to refer to myself as that. When someone's coming out and actually researching this stuff and sending emails being like, I've been targeted, these are the 10 things that have happened to me that are consistent. Whether it's around them or not, they're still being subjected to it. And I truly believe that over 75% of the world's population are being targeted. Some of them have figured it out, and some of them haven't. So that's where I'm going to agree to disagree with this gentleman.
As analytically as pure as you could have, say, pre-internet, because now people can mirror each other's ideas. There's no way to sort it out from my perspective, and it's not something that I can even approach. It's just prohibitively costly, and in my view.
Wait, I came up with a great idea. I do know how we could sort it out. We need to know how our names got on the list in the first place, because it only takes 2 people to report you to the Fusion Center to put you on the targeted list. And that's my opinion.
Be ineffective. You know, you always get asked about the countermeasures. You know, what can I do to protect myself, protect my family? And the answer is there's really nothing you can do in terms of electromechanically, without spending a huge amount of money. Because when you think about all the different ways that the signal can be carried in, you know, you're going to carry a bunch of hardware around. You're going to live in a Faraday cage. I mean, the answer is ultimately political change. You can't guard against every external signal. What we do know is that strong system, when your system is strong, these weak signals tend to be ignored. You know, you tend to focus on your own system. But when you look around the United States as an example, most people are under a constant state of stress. If you look around the world, most people are in a constant state of stress.
And surveillance.
When you are, if you look at an EEG of brain activity, you'll see incoherent brain patterns, those associated with flight and fight responses, not those associated with higher ordered thinking, or these anomalous human potentials, these extraordinary human potentials that are reported in the literature. You only achieve those in a state of calm. So just watching the news, just watching a TV commercial, worrying about how you smell, how your teeth look, all those things that are messages to you every day that create an underlying level of insecurity. That's the most fundamental, easiest form of mind control you could ever initiate. Just keep people in a constant state of stress, and you'll never reach your higher states of consciousness. You'll never engage your political process on a highly intellectual basis. What you'll see is mobs, riots, those kinds of activities manifest, and that's exactly what we're seeing around the planet today. Even within this country, we see more violence.
Now, do you think that that was okay for the police officer to do that? No. So the only way that we're going to fight him is to use the same tool that they created to control us. And who do you think created Google? I'm going to say it's a 3-letter agency.
Coming out. Half of the mass shootings have been since, 2007? Ever reported in the United States. Why is that? What have we done to change ourselves so fundamentally, to become so stressed as a population that for a certain segment, this is how it breaks out? The opposite is what's needed. Knowledge and control of our own lives, our own destinies, our individual sovereignty being restored, and this kind of group think, or the idea that government can do better for us, is fundamentally wrong and violates the very foundations of what our nations were formed under. Self-determination starts with total self-understanding, awareness, and then acting on what we believe to be right and true, not being told what's right and what's true, but knowing it, and each one of us know it. When you think about sort of the flip side of this, we've been talking about a lot of the military aspects, but on the flip side, the very same things that are being learned for military weapons development are the very same things that we need in some of our new science areas, particularly in the mind effects area. When you think about one of the things that have been developed and is actually used around the world today is brain biofeedback, neurobiofeedback, where instead of using psychoactive drugs, where you have a kid that's perhaps hyperactive or perhaps mentally is moving too slow, what they can do is actually teach a child with feedback by hooking them up to an EEG that monitors their brain activity in real time and then gives them some kind of a graphic. In this case, it would be maybe a bouncing ball on a computer screen. And if they get the ball to bounce up to a certain height, it's when their brain is in that ideal state for learning and focused attention. And over an hour, do it an hour a day for 30 to 45 sessions, and you don't need psychoactive drugs to hit that brain state. You can do it at will with no devices, because it's a training tool, like training the muscles in your body, you're training the muscles in your brain, if you will, using that analogy. So you're literally learning how to manipulate your brain activity into the ideal state for learning. You can use it for sleep, for relaxation, for meditation, for concentration, for a number of areas. But where you're deciding on what the input is, you're deciding on what that is going to be and why you're doing it, and you're learning how to do it yourself. This is the answer. In fact, the places where this has been done, over 80% of children have been taken off of psychoactive drugs because they don't need them anymore. That's the answer when you look forward. When you look at electrophysiology, the effects of electromagnetic fields on the body for healing purposes, this is where the big science is going to be in the 21st century. It's not going to be the old pharmaceutical chemical model, because that's way down the line. You can create chemical reactions with energetic effects. This is the science of biophysics. Energetic effects that create chemical reactions, that create stabilities within the body. Rather than starting midway and trying to manipulate chemistry, we can start at the very root and create natural ways for us to learn how to moderate our biological functions. This can be useful both from a directed standpoint on our own, but also from a standpoint of healing sciences in the future. In fact, a document, Low Intensity Conflict in Modern Technology, published in 1984 by Maxwell Air Force Base, has a whole section on electromagnetic weapons that deals with the opposite side, that deals with healing of bone fractures at accelerated rates, that deal with the effects of acupuncture on pain mitigation and a lot of other issues that are mysterious from a science perspective today, but are becoming much clearer as our science advances and more published work in these areas comes forward outside of the military regime. Bioaural beat is another method, and bioaural beat was developed by Robert Monroe, who was a radio engineer. And what he had happen is he had what's called a spontaneous OBE, out-of-body experience, where he felt like he left his body and was viewing it. And he got very curious about this. And he began to study this in sort of a subsidiary of his own company. And he developed a patent, a couple of patents back in the, I believe they were in the 80s when they were actually issued, but where he created a situation where this external signal, because we can only hear, we can't hear below 400 hertz or pulses per second. But these effects to create entrainment need to be in the 1 to 12 hertz range for certain applications, for learning, for these experiences that Monroe reported, these senses of out of body and so on. But to get to that, you put in a signal in one ear at, say, 15,000 hertz, which is where we can all hear, most of us can hear within that range. You put in one at 15,007 hertz. They cancel and leave 15,000 minus 15,007 leaves you 7. And that beat frequency of 7 hertz, the brain begins to pulse to. And this is the frequency following response, pulsing to that signal, but triggered by a bioaural beat, which was a secret of the hemisync development. Now, what they use that for is creating, and there's hundreds now, recordings, music recordings that embed signals that, and then verbal cues for quitting smoking, losing weight, enhancing meditation, enhancing concentration. All these kinds of things have been developed by a greater understanding of the brain and how it works. Bioaural beat is just one method of getting there through sound within that frequency range. You can use electrocranial stimulation, put electrodes on the head that pulse a DC current in at the same 7 hertz and achieve the same kind of entrainment effect. But it's hemisync is kind of clean because you just use audio headset, standard audio headset, and CDs. So it's cheap, it's clean, and you're picking it. And any subliminals, words, you can actually, in a multi-channel music player, you can actually turn it and hear exactly what those words are, which is extremely important for this reason. If I say the word dog, some people get all warm and fuzzy. Other people get gripped with fear based on how they what they attach to those word symbols because of childhood experiences or whatever. So knowing what the words are and how they integrate into your belief system is fundamental to deciding what technologies, if any, you're interested in. There's other technologies, light and sound devices that use light and sound stimulation, where you can actually make your own recording of your own voice, giving you your own suggestions and plug them right and jack them right in. So what you end up doing is taking your brain into a very receptive state, and then you plug in your own ideas, your own words. That's a great way to modify behavior because you trust your own voice more than anyone else's, and it's your own programming, literally your own programming. PBS, the Public Broadcasting System in the US, did a program called the Worldwide Mind. Very interesting. And what they say will happen in the next 50 or 100 years, and I agree, is the same thing that happened with the internet, where we've connected everyone electronically. Imagine that next layer of resolution, which is where this technology goes, connecting us all mentally.
This is the hive mind that I was referring to earlier. It's kind of terrifying if you ask me, but I don't like to be told what to do, and I'm a very private person generally until they piss me off.
Now that becomes a big question in everyone's mind. Is that the world you want to live in, where everyone is transparent to one another through a technology that reveals every thought that you ever had? In my view, part of Judgment Day is when we are transparent and you can look into another person and see everything that's in there. Then the question is, are we forgiving enough as a species to forgive ourselves and forgive each other for all of that? And really, that is the next leap, in my view, because it's the next leap of evolution. The difference is it happens naturally by our own internal mechanisms as opposed to being imposed on us. And then how will that information be used? You've seen what they've done with the internet. If they could literally take your memory set and catalog it across the planet, would they do it? Could we do it?
Yep.
With the supercomputers anticipated in the future, quantum computing would allow us that possibility and will give us enough modeling capacity to actually do something with it. That's the edge of where we are technologically in the public right now. Quantum computing changes it all. What would take every person, 6-7 billion people on the planet, doing a hand calculation every 5 seconds for 60 hours is what today's computer does in 1 second. Now imagine all that computing going on for 1 trillion years. That's what a supercomputer will do in 1 hour. That will change everything about everything. And whoever gets there first controls everything. And that's the race in the 21st century, is quantum computing and its effect on every electromagnetic, every electromechanical device on the planet, and then ultimately every other electromagnetically moderated entity, which is us, and everything else on the planet that can be influenced by energy, can be manipulated when you can model it all. And that gives us that capacity. We're close. We're on the edge. Some would already say some governments already possess quantum computing capacity that takes us there. This generation will decide how that framework moves forward.
I agree.
Freedom, how do you define it? From my perspective, it's being, to the optimum extent, free to pursue whatever is in your own self-interest, as long as you don't violate the rights or interests of another. It's that simple. We should be able to pursue what we love, what we care about, what we're enthusiastic about, what we're passionate about in this life, with the minimal amount of government interference, with the minimal interference on another person's life. But we should be free to act as human beings, sovereign human beings, created in the image of a creator by most of the major religions' view of the world, and I believe that. And as such, who has the right to impose their will on me or on you?
Yeah. Who has the right to impose their will on me or on you? So if you've liked this Cellocast, please like, subscribe, and share. And as always, stay strong. We've got this. Thank you for listening to the Unveiling Shadows podcast. I hope today's episode has shed light on the experiences that too often remain hidden. If you or someone you know has a story to share, please reach out to me. Remember, you're not alone and your voice matters. Follow me on social media and subscribe to the podcast for more inspiring stories. Until next time, stay strong and keep unveiling the shadows.